So Cogito, ergo sum, tabula rasa, and other sayings. This video, it's an introductory one. We're going to talk a little bit and to think a little bit about our brains and how they work. Certainly from the point of view of designing software that interacts with people, this is actually quite an important element of it. Now, it really goes without saying that our brains are amazing in a very literal sense, and I do mean literal as in literally as opposed to metaphorically. Literally, they do shape and they determine who and what we are. They're fundamental to this. And in a very real sense as well, this depends upon the structure and operation of the brain. Some of the signs that we had at the start in terms of tabula rasa and other ones, it taps into some of those conversations that have happened over thousands of years as to who we are, what makes us, how do we think, how do we operate. And we now understand an awful lot more with regard to the structure of the brain and how this actually affects how we perceive things and indeed how we think. And through this introductory part of the course, we want to explore those aspects in more detail because it really is quite important that we do have a bit of an understanding if we're then to better design software that interacts with users. So I'm going to start with a few examples of visual illusions, because I want to try to make the point then that our brain is an active thing. It does process and interpret what we see. And this is really quite an interesting example where the brain is interpreting the content. And for example, it's a corridor, but looking down it, you can think actually there's a sort of a large sloped area that goes in. But if you look from the other perspective, it still looks a bit weird, but you don't get to see that. And that's an example there of where we present the brain with an image where the brain perceives that as having a certain curvature and shape. And there's a good way of actually sort of highlighting this. So if in the image on the left, if you have a look at this region here, so this is what we might more naturally perceive as a vertical drop going down. Whereas over in the image on the right, we can see actually it's just a piece of white that horizontally goes out. It's interesting, but the key point I want to highlight through this here is that what we see, our brain interprets, and it's the interpretation of that then that we perceive, we become conscious of, that we use. A few more examples then of sort of a visual illusion or optical illusions, so you want to colour them. So one's, for example, is kinesia triangles, and you can see this over in the image over on the right hand side, where we can look at those and we can see something that looks triangle-like and almost sort of seems to step out and to stand up. There isn't actually any triangle there, but it's just an example of where our brain sees a couple of sort of regions or shapes where it then thinks, there must be a triangle there. And because it thinks there must be a triangle there, that's notionally what we actually see. And it's a good example then, you can look at the two examples down at the bottom, where on the left-hand side, we do have something that looks like the appearance of a triangle, whereas over on the right-hand side, where we've inverted or turned around the individual three circles, it doesn't appear. The Mueller-Lyle illusion is another one. You can see this over in the left hand side of the screen, where we've got lines all of exactly the same length, but depending upon what we put, if we put sort of enclosing arrows or widening arrows at the end of those lines, we perceive them to be of different lengths. So our brain is actually quite active then in terms of interpreting what we get to see. A couple of other interesting examples. One's the Mueller illusion, and this is really interesting one because it ties into how we perceive and interpret colours actually depends upon the colours that surround the colour we're looking at. So if we have a look over at, we've got two squares, A and B. Looking at this normally, we can see that, okay, so we have our green cylinder. It's casting a shadow. And if I were to ask you, well, describe the colour of square A and describe the colour of square B, you might say A is a dark grey and B's a light grey. In reality, they are exactly the same colour. The pixel colours are no difference, and you can see this down the bottom left-hand side. It's just because we see B inside a darker surrounding, we perceive it more as, oh, it's in the shadow that's been cast, that our brain thinks, oh, it must actually then be lighter in colour because we're seeing it in shadow. Another really interesting example of the Munkar illusion then is what you can see here. We've got two dogs. In one case, you might describe the one on the right as kind of a bluey colour, and the one on the left is kind of a yellowy colour. The reality is both of those dogs are identical in colour. There's absolutely no difference between them whatsoever. It's just because the one on the right hand side is within more of a strong yellow background that we then perceive that as more blue, and the one over on the left hand side is within a more darker blue background, so we perceive the colour as more yellow. So it's an interesting aspect. Now, why are we starting off with this here? The reason and the key takeaway from all of this is that our brain does interpret what we see, and that is of use to us as people who want to design software, particularly when we're thinking about our interfaces. How we set our interfaces out, how we shape them, we can do things in terms of colours and arrangements that will help get across to the user more effortlessly, more naturally, the structures that we want for them to see. And if we understand some of the aspects about how the brain interprets things, it means then that we can take that into the interfaces and create interfaces that will be more naturally and correctly perceived as we would like the user to perceive them as we want to. And you see an example here where we have stop war peace now or stop peace war now. Same words, depending on how you segment and group them and link them together through colour, you change quite radically the message. And these are things then we're going to be picking up through this particular section. The next video, we're actually going to have a little look at influence then. So other than visual aspects, our brain actually does quite a lot about how we take and interpret other types of information and use that in terms of our decision making.